I would recommend that you see the film Dark Waters, a documentary disguised as a Hollywood movie, or the reverse, you can decide. In that case, the industry led us to believe that 2 PFASs were harmless. And as a result of lawsuits in the U.S., so it's the PFOA and the PFOS that were, they suggested they were harmless. Now there's a deal that was struck for over $13 billion American dollars to help treat drinking water which is contaminated by these particular PFASs, the PFOA and the PFOS. That's only in the U.S. There's no equivalent in Canada. So in our lab, we collected about 500 samples of drinking water from the tap throughout Quebec. And out of those 500, there were only 2 where we could not detect PFAS. So we can't say that there's 0 content, but if we improved our methods, we probably would have done it. Because it is always a synthetic substance. Thanks to this research project, we were able to identify that there were cities, municipalities, where people are drinking water that's above the standards. And so is it normal that it's through one of my students' research project that we were able to identify pollution of water in La Baie, in Val-Gor, in Sainte-Cécile-de-Milton. And so it's either on a military base or a dump or industrial, a landfill site, or exercises by firemen with foam that contained PFASs that were conducted in an inappropriate way. In February 2003, Health Canada made recommendations for PFAS in drinking water, which seemed reasonable to me. It was a bit more ambitious than before, but we're 1 year later, and these recommendations have still not been adopted. There were comments, but we're still waiting to see any results. So we need to tackle emerging contaminants such as PFAS or plastics, and in order to do that, we need to better control what is happening upstream. Otherwise, it's found in our rivers, our lakes, our drinking water, our food, our air. It's found just about everywhere. And these are challenges that are very, very difficult to deal with. When I try and train stakeholders or groups that are involved, it's very difficult for me to know what to do because there's so many different groups. Everyone plays within their prerogatives, their mandate, and it's also there's this mixture of federal, provincial, and municipal authorities or agencies. So I lament the fact that the communication is really difficult amongst all these groups. And so our wastewater contains a lot. So the wastewater treatment plants that keep some PFAS in the solids. Professor Sauvé, it's really, really interesting. But we've the time that was allowed has elapsed. We'll come back to you later once the other panelists have given their preliminary declarations. So we'll go on with Ms. McCassie-Baker from Environmental Defence Canada.
Bonjour et merci.
Good morning and thank you.
Thank you for including PFAS in your study, as this class of chemicals, as mentioned, poses such a significant danger to freshwater ecosystems, source waters, and human and environmental health. This committee has heard from municipal leaders who have not had the resources to upgrade their water treatment facilities to filter out PFAS, and who are also unable to address the causes of source water contamination in their own communities. The government states that 98.5% of Canadians have PFAS in their blood. Drinking water and freshwater consumption, as well as product-based exposures, are significant sources of ongoing PFAS exposure. These forever chemicals don't break down, they make us sick, and other jurisdictions have already taken action. Scientists, firefighters, Northern Indigenous health experts, environmental health organizations, and some of the world's leading product brands are pushing for class-based PFAS phase-outs. recent polling from Advocacy found that 4 out of 5 Canadians want to see federal government action on PFAS. We asked the committee to protect freshwater and ensure all PFAS are included in the government's class-based listing under SEPA, and that regulations align with the EU and US states to move quickly and impose a product-based phase-out. These chemicals persist because PFAS have a strong fluorine-carbon bond. And it is the strongest bond in organic chemistry, and because of this, once PFAS are formed, they don't break down. Instead, they persist forever and accumulate in the environment and our bodies. For years, stain-proof and waterproof forever chemicals have been used in industry, pulp and paper production, fracking fluid, plastics, electronics manufacturing, and in hundreds of product types, as mentioned earlier. There are now thousands of PFAS on the market, and they are in over 200 product categories. Scientists with expertise in PFAS state that all well-studied PFAS show human health harms, and that the health and environmental risks of PFAS, coupled with their extreme environmental persistence, requires a class-based approach. The OECD definition of PFAS, used in the government's own risk assessment, further reinforces regulating PFAS as a class. Cancers, kidney disease, reproductive harms are just a few of the many ways that PFAS can impact our health at relatively low levels of exposure, as they mimic fatty acids in our body, disrupt hormones, and suppress our immune system. Northern Indigenous people are particularly impacted by PFAS contamination, and leaders have been calling for the urgent need to act. Firefighters are also highly exposed. Through firefighting gear and foams, firefighters now die more from exposure-related cancers than they do from fighting fires. PFAS cleanup costs, as mentioned, are in the range of billions of dollars, and this should not be borne by municipalities attempting to depollute their source water. It is the chemical companies who have known about and concealed the toxicity of PFAS for decades who must be held liable for this cleanup. In fact, we're seeing municipalities in the US, as mentioned, sue chemical companies over the cost to depollute their source water and drinking water. And these settlements have just begun. Other jurisdictions are protecting their fresh water by regulating and prohibiting PFAS. Canada needs to do the same. The US is in the midst of implementing its 3-year PFAS strategy, and they established a binding drinking water standard for some PFAS. Many US states are bringing in drinking water standards and product-based phase-outs in cosmetics, textiles, food packaging, and these states include California, Washington, New York, and Maine. The EU has a roadmap for phasing out PFAS in products, starting quickly with the product types with existing safer substitutions, and Denmark has also started taking action to get this class of chemicals out of their paper products. Urgent action is needed to address this growing PFAS threat in Canada. The Canadian government must support municipalities that need federal leadership to prohibit the sources of PFAS. The federal government recently proposed a municipal drinking water objective, but until it prohibits PFAS contamination of our waters from products and industrial releases, this objective will do little to reduce PFAS contamination in our drinking water. This government can and must do more to advance PFAS regulatory action and set strong rules to drive reformulation of products away from PFAS, to switch to existing safer alternatives, and push industry to invest in innovation.
Thank you.
Developed for
Thanks
safer
very much.
innovation.
I think we're going to have a fascinating discussion this morning. Commissioner DeMarco, thank you for being with us and contributing to our water study today. We really appreciate it. And so please go ahead with your opening statement.
Monsieur le Président, je suis heureux d'être ici aujourd'hui afin d'apporter ma contribution à l'étude.
Mr. Chair, I'm very happy to be here today to contribute to the committee's study of the federal government's role in the protection and management of Canada's freshwater resources. I like to acknowledge that this hearing is taking place on the unceded traditional territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. I'm accompanied by James Mackenzie and Milan Duvniak, who are both senior directors in our office. Today, I'm going to talk about 3 areas in which we have recommended improvements as concerns freshwater management. These are maintaining a relevant knowledge base on freshwater resources, enforcing laws and regulations to protect Canada's freshwater resources, and strengthening collaboration. My statement is based on 3 audit reports. Our own 2022 report on the protection of aquatic species at risk, our 2021 report on scientific activities in certain watersheds, and our 2019 report on the protection of fish from mining effluents. I will start by talking about maintaining a relevant knowledge base on freshwater resources. This would include researching and monitoring water quality, water quantity, and the status of freshwater species. It also includes research and monitoring of risks associated with water bodies, such as excess nutrients and algal blooms, as well as the effectiveness of measures to protect freshwater resources. In our audit on the protection of aquatic species at risk, we found that Fisheries and Oceans Canada had undertaken research on aquatic species, but had focused their knowledge acquisition activities on species of commercial value. This left some significant gaps in its knowledge of other species and had a direct impact on their protection. Knowledge acquisition is essential for assessing the status of species and for developing strategies to protect them. Many of Canada's species that have disappeared completely were found in freshwater.
Enforcing laws and regulations protecting Canada's freshwater resources. The Fisheries Act and the Species at Risk Act provide the legal basis for protecting and conserving fish, fish habitat, and aquatic species at risk. However, laws and regulations are not sufficient on their own. They need to be administered and enforced fairly, predictably, and consistently. In our audit of protecting aquatic species at risk, we found that Fisheries and Oceans Canada did not have enough staff to enforce compliance. This was particularly evident in the Ontario and Prairie region, which is responsible for managing most of the freshwater species at risk. In our audit of protecting fish from mining effluent, we found that Environment and Climate Change Canada reported high compliance with effluent limits by metal mines. However, the department's reporting was not comprehensive because it did not have complete information for roughly a third of the mines. We also found that non-metal mines, such as potash, coal, and oil sands mines, were inspected less frequently than metal mines. In our view, regularly inspecting non-metal mines is important because these mines are not authorized to release any effluent that is harmful to fish or their habitat. Finally, I'd like to discuss fostering collaboration. In our audit of scientific activities in selected water basins, we found that Environment and Climate Change Canada and Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada were moving in the right direction in terms of collaborating on scientific activities. However, we found that their work could have a greater impact on improving water quality if they further coordinated their scientific efforts. The departments would also benefit from making better use of existing watershed science coordination committees and by establishing a National Science Coordination Steering Committee to address freshwater concerns. In conclusion, Canada is still facing water quality issues caused by excess nutrients and industrial pollution. As well, it has a long list of aquatic species at risk that rely on healthy freshwater ecosystems. The federal government plays an essential role in protecting and managing Canada's freshwater resources. Mr. Chair, this concludes my opening remarks. We'd be pleased to answer any questions the committee may have. Thank you.
Much, Commissioner. We'll go now to Mr. Paul Westsells from Western Copper and Gold, who's on the screen on video conference. Go ahead, Mr. Westsells.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chair, members of the committee, for the invitation and honor to speak today. My name is Paul Westels, President of Western Copper and Gold. I'm accompanied by our Vice President of Environmental and Community Affairs, Ms. Sheena Shaw. Our flagship Casino Copper Gold project, a copper, gold, molybdenum, and silver deposit, is located approximately 300 kilometers northwest of Whitehorse in the Yukon. The Casino project ranks as among the largest copper, gold, molybdenum projects in Canada, and once operational, will be the largest critical minerals project in Canada by annual revenue. Rio Tinto is a strategic investor in the project since 2021 and currently owns approximately 10% of the company. And Mitsubishi Materials purchased a 5% stake in the company in early 2023. The Casino project is anticipated to produce approximately 4.3 billion pounds of copper, 7 million ounces of gold, 36 million ounces of silver, and 350 million pounds of molybdenum over the 27-year life of mine, and will significantly contribute to the Yukon's, Canada's, and the world's transition to a green economy. While we say now that this mine has a 27-year life, the known resource could in fact sustain operations for almost 100 years, making ours a project that would bring generational prosperity, jobs, and development to Canada's north. Water is the foundation of an ecosystem. It supports and maintains healthy ecological processes for fish, wildlife, and humans. Our priority is to be a responsible steward of the water we share through future operational efficiencies and conservation. For Canada's responsible mining companies like Western, the federal government's role in safeguarding and managing the nation's freshwater resources is critical, especially in the context of increasing water scarcity. That's why we have designed a project with industry-leading best practices. We have been conducting baseline studies for geochemistry, hydrology, surface water quality, and groundwater for almost 15 years to ensure that our project is planned and developed in a way that achieves minimal impact to the environment and ecosystems. Western understands the importance of watershed management and are committed to contributing positively to the areas we operate in. Opening and operating a mine in the Yukon has a different legislative and regulatory requirements than in southern Canada. The Yukon Environmental and Socioeconomic Assessment Act, or YESA, is the legislation that has come from modern treaties between federal, territorial, and First Nation governments. The assessment is open, accountable, and transparent, and is based on fundamental principles of co-management of resources, as was enshrined in these treaties. At Western Copper and Gold, we are dedicated to building strong, respectful, and mutually beneficial relationships with all stakeholders, particularly Indigenous communities, ensuring their rights, tradition, and knowledge are at the forefront of our water management strategies. For projects such as ours, we believe that regulatory certainty is just as important as a speedy approval time. We value the principles of the Yukon First Nation final agreements and of the YESA process, and want to stress that any legislative or regulatory changes to the process should be considered carefully, as changes in the process in the Yukon could have impacts on First Nation treaty rights and hurt the long-term trust that the process has come to embody. We are excited to be part of Canada's critical minerals infrastructure and to be building an engine of economic prosperity while at the same time being strong stewards for the environment. Thank you for the opportunity to share our perspective and comments. I look forward to any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Westels. We'll go now to the first round of questions, and it is Mr. Leslie who's leading off for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to start with the Environment Commissioner. In your opening remarks, you mentioned excessive nutrients, and I know you're doing an upcoming study in 2024 on fertilizer emissions. But you also mentioned the coordination between Environment and Climate Change Canada and Agriculture Canada in particular. And I having worked previously in agriculture, I thought back to the time when we had Environment Department show up in black SUVs and trespass to take water samples. I think it was a good example of not exactly coordinating with Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, nor working with stakeholders. You know, part of the discussion regarding fresh water is the products that farmers are putting on their fields. And in particular, fertilizer. As part of your upcoming yet-to-be-released study, Have you looked at that piece as it relates to water, or is it more about emissions?
So on our list of, and I'm glad to see that you're keeping an eye on our upcoming reports. We disclose on our website what's coming in the next couple of rounds of reports, including this spring's. That is about agriculture and climate change mitigation. That's the focus of that report. Although nutrients from agriculture were one of the key foci of the water basins report that we spoke about just a few minutes ago. So yeah, that upcoming report will not look at the interaction between nutrient runoff and water, because we did address that in the water basins report just 2 years ago.
Thank you. Just in terms of the emissions calculations from, in particular, nitrogen, it's a very complex calculation to come to what is still a very rough estimate, and still doesn't take into account for our nutrient stewardship practice adoption, for example. Have you any consideration on how we can try to improve the methodology of better understanding what N2O emissions we actually have here in Canada as it relates to what we need to submit to our national inventory reporting requirements? And because we're not at a point at the ground level or field level we can actually measure, is there a way that you think we can try to improve that?
Yeah, as you've heard from me before, there's a few areas in Canada where the data and the measurements are not as reliable as I'd like to see, and as I'm sure you'd like to see. This includes methane and a variety of ones relating to land use change, and forestry, including agriculture. So all I can say is please stay tuned for our spring report on agriculture and climate change. We do look at the trends in emissions in that sector. It's not as important a sector in terms of total emissions, say, for example, compared to oil and gas or transportation, but it is still a significant contributor. And it's also a potential solution, because good agricultural practices can help sequester carbon. So I'll leave it at that, because I don't want to let the cat out of the bag in terms of our spring tabling and respect for Parliament.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that. And obviously the government's stated objective is a 30% reduction in fertilizer emissions from fertilizer, but it's also going to have a major impact on yields, as noted in the Myers-Norris Penny report, and costing about $10.4 billion by 2030 if that target is hit. So I'm just curious, from your assessment, is the government needing to take into consideration the economic impact of this objective of 30% reduction?
Yeah, as I've said in several other reports, including the Lessons Learned report when we talked about oil and gas, or even the mining effluent report that I just mentioned earlier, we often preface our reports with both the economic, the positive economic impacts associated with an industry, as well as any social benefits associated with it, along with the environmental consequences that need to be managed as well. So a full cost accounting approach is really at the forefront of our sustainable development monitoring work that we do on an ongoing basis. So yes, very much agree that the social, economic, and environmental factors all need to be looked at together in finding solutions, so that we don't just squeeze the balloon and cause one problem to be transferred to another location without solving the larger issue.
Thank you, Commissioner. Moving to Mr. West Sells from Western Copper and Gold. I'm just, you mentioned some of the world-leading best practices that you as a company have been undertaking relating to water over the past 15 years. I'm wondering if you could expand on what exactly those practices are, why you're doing them, and what value you think they have to the legitimacy of the project and the protection of the environment.
Sure. You know, I mean, one of the things that we can do as a modern mine is have, you know, water at the forefront and water quality at the forefront of our design. So, I mean, for example, one of the things that we've done with our project, you know, our project is located about 20 kilometers away from the Yukon River. And for those of you that haven't been up to the Yukon River it's the lifeblood of the Yukon. You know, it's very important to the First Nations and really all of the Yukoners. And so what we've been able to do is to design our mine so that all of the drainage from the mine itself will drain away from the Yukon River. And that's just, you know, a series of small steps that have been put into place to make sure that the drainage goes away. The other thing that we do in the operation of our mine is we try to absolutely minimize the use of fresh water. So we recycle as much water as possible. within the process so that our reliance on any new fresh water is minimized. And then the last thing that we do is really try to minimize any discharge from the mine. So, right now during operations, there will be minimal discharge from the mine. So to absolutely ensure, and any discharge that does come from the mine is, of course, treated and meets the discharge requirements.
Thanks very much. We'll go to Mr. Van Koeverden now, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to all of our witnesses and experts for attending today. This is a really remarkable panel. My question is related to water scarcity and climate change. As weather changes and as the climate warms, and as we've seen in southwestern Ontario and Alberta this year, there are water scarcity concerns. Oftentimes, around this time of year, we see really elevated water levels in the Great Lakes and in the tributaries that lead into it. My anecdotal evidence and what's been observed by people who do this sort of observational work is that the water levels are really low. So Canada is blessed with a plentiful and abundant supply of fresh water, particularly compared to other countries. But in the context of the solutions for preventing water scarcity, preventing global water scarcity from impacting Canada with respect to us being, a large steward of it, I suppose. What considerations ought the federal government take under advisement with respect to water scarcity? And certainly, if PFAS applies, then I'd love to hear that context as well. That question's for anybody. Monsieur Sauvé?
Thank you. In terms of scarcity and PFAS, making the link is not necessarily obvious, but clearly, when there's less water, whatever is left will have a higher concentration. The PFAS don't degrade. Well, they degrade a little bit, but very, 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 very slowly. So there's a potential for aggravation of pollution problem because there's going to be less water, if you wish. The same amount of contaminants in a lower amount will cause issues. So that's definitely, in terms of contamination, that's one of the issues. The other issue I see is related more to the variations. So there are some periods where there's going to be too much water, and there's going to be flooding, and there's going to be spreading of the contamination. And after it doesn't prevent that later in the summer, there's going to be scarcity. So it's not just less and low, it's just higher variation are going to cause a lot more trouble.
Thank you. And with respect to greenhouse gas emissions, would anybody like to speak to the considerations around acidification and pH concerns as they apply to more traditionally waterborne pollutants? And I'll tell you where I'm kind of going with this because I might run out of time. Plastic pollution in water has always been considered like something that you can see. It's people will walk by a stream or on a beach and they'll pick up plastic pollution. CO2 is very different. Other emissions like methane are invisible. We don't see them, but they have a really negative impact on our natural environment and on climate change. PFAS, sort of the worst of both. They're invisible, they have a really negative impact, and they're much, much more difficult to clean up, maybe as hard as CO2 is to remove from the atmosphere. Any reflections on that relationship?
I would say there is an important relationship between microplastics and PFAS. Microplastics can often transport PFAS through the environment. Often how we see bioaccumulation occurring within fish, which is where we can see consuming a serving of freshwater fish can expose you to as much PFAS as you would consume drinking a month's worth of contaminated drinking water. So this is an interesting analogy in that, as plastics become invisible, they also create a much bigger toxics problem, being a vector for transporting these substances in our environment. But I'll defer to our colleagues about the climate pieces if they want to refer to it.
Just add quickly that it's not well known, but some of the PFAS are volatile. And so if you eat them up, and some of the degradation byproduct also can be released to the air. So some of the contamination in faraway lakes that should be pristine with PFAS is from aerial deposition of PFAS byproducts.
Would anybody online like to reflect on any of those things? I recognize that sometimes being online doesn't provide you with the same opportunity to interject.
I mean, in terms of greenhouse gas acidification, I mean, for a mining project, obviously, the acidification, we don't really see that as a big impact. But your previous comment on drought and climate change is very interesting. In that, one of the things and one of the key components of our regulatory review will be the impact of climate change on our project. So, echoing some of the other comments, we will need to look not only at drought, but at increased, precipitation and rainfall, increased snow, of course, being up in the Yukon, and that is a key change that I've seen over my career is that is an important part of what we will be reviewed with as we go through the regulatory process.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll see the rest of my time.
Thank you. Madame Posey.
Oui, alors merci.
Yes, so thank you to all our witnesses for being here, being online. Mr. Sauvé, thank you for being here with us. You published in 2022 with Mr. Benoit Barrault, who was one of our witnesses, a scientific article, and the French title could be How Should We Interpret in a New Regulatory System the FAS and FOS substances? And in your article, at the end, you say, as toxicology science progresses and the technologies of elimination of PFAS, it's probable that directives about water and other ways of penetration and exposure become stricter. My question is, yes, it's true that science and technology does progress, but how can we make sure that the regulation, that tightening regulations will follow these progresses? Well, I'm not an expert in regulation, but that comment can be compared to what we know about toxicology for lead, arsenic, and mercury. There are no cases that we know where historically we increased the thresholds. They always went down. It never happened that we discovered that things were less toxic than we thought. We always find other studies, other effects. So it's obvious that even with the data that we do have currently for PFAS, we will be accumulating new data which will tell us that effects are recorded at ever lower levels. And the thresholds that were determined in the U.S., as the Commissioner mentioned, were established with a cost-benefit analysis. How many lives are we going to save? How many lives will we lose? So by putting economic value on that. So as technology and the capacity for PFAS removal will improve, because they're the most difficult molecules to destroy or eliminate. So when it's cheaper, that analysis will have to be redone, and it will become more valid to have more strict regulation and to lower our thresholds. But the industry people tells us, well, we're doing everything really well. The reverse osmosis process works really well. Maybe we don't need to reduce our production. We maybe don't need stricter regulation. That's often that we're being told by industry. And Ms. Barker also talked about the need for stricter regulation. So I'd like to hear you say that maybe the legislator should use the precautionary principle above all. Yes, it's clear that I think the precautionary principle is really important. And now we're trying to remove it from our drinking water, from our sources of water. It's very difficult because we allowed an unregulated use in all kinds of fields where it was really a question of comfort. It wasn't essential reason of wrapping hamburgers or having water-resistant mascara. So I think we have to regulate upstream, and we know that industry will have both feet on the brake to avoid regulation. Could you talk to us about these 500 samples that you made and analyzed, and tell us what you observed in these samples? Well, in the samples, what I saw that over about 500, slightly less than 500 samples, there were 95% of those that were below the thresholds proposed by Health Canada. So a broad majority of those samples meet the standards imposed by Health Canada on drinking water. Now, we're only talking about drinking water. So carrying out this large-scale kind of study allows us to identify hot spots, places where there are problems. And so we identified 5 or 6 of them in Quebec, where either the cities instituted specific water treatment processes. Some people closed wells. Some people have treatment in their own houses. So there's a real impact on the quality of water and the health of people in those areas. Yes, and when we apply the principles of regulation, the agencies carrying out regulatory agencies should consider that all PFASs are likely to have negative effects on health and on the environment. So we should extend a ban on all the non-essential uses, for example, cosmetics, etc. Could you tell us what the quotient of danger or of risk would be in with these pollutants? Well, the danger or risk quotient, often it's where we measure the concentrations in the environment and we compare it with what we know about the thresholds where there is toxicity, where there's an effect on health or another. And if we're below that, well, we have a lower quotient. And if we're above it, it's higher, and it's a problem. The problem is that with PFAS, when we make those comparisons, we're all too exposed to them. We all have PFAS in our blood that's higher, these thresholds, and there are risks with cholesterol and cancer, etc. Thank you. Ms. Collins?
Mr. Chair, and I want to thank all the witnesses for being here today. My first question is for Ms. Barker, and I've spoken to firefighters from my home community of Victoria, but also for firefighters across the country who have been extremely impacted by forever chemicals. Many of them have colleagues who have lost their lives from cancer, and firefighters shouldn't be dying at higher rates from cancer than from firefighting. Can you tell me a little bit more about the impacts of PFAS, forever chemicals, on firefighters and in firefighting equipment?
So firefighters themselves are extremely articulate on this very complex issue. If you ask a firefighter about PFAS, they will tell you that not only are they being exposed through their gear and the foams that they've been using on the job, but they've also been actively doing research to draw the linkages between the types of cancer that they're dealing with these exposures, which is very difficult and very expensive work. They are also doing that work on children's cancers because their children also disproportionately suffer from cancers. So this is a huge issue in Canada and around the world. This is something that their unions have been actively pushing, not only to protect their workers, but to protect their communities. And this is an opportunity for Canada to celebrate the good work we've done. We have a draft assessment in front of us that is quite strong, that makes the case on health. It makes the case on environment. It draws out a clear class of chemical approach instead of going one by one through thousands of these substances, by taking the precautionary approach to MP Posé's point, this is an opportunity for us to demonstrate to not only ourselves but the world that Canada has and can continue to be a real leader on toxics.
Thank you. And firefighters keep us safe. We should be doing everything we can to keep them and their children safe. One of the things that the firefighter told me was that if you were to throw his gear into an Olympic-sized pool, the toxicity level of that pool would mean that they would have to treat it as a contaminated site. The impact that is having on our groundwater, that this gear is so filled with forever chemicals. Now, the plastics industry has said that these forever chemicals are essential. And I'm curious, we've heard such deep concerns from firefighters, but communities, municipalities, everyday Canadians. Can you talk a little bit about your response to the industry when they say something like that?
I would say that the companies, from production through to public brands, retailers, throughout the supply chain, the smart money is moving away from PFAS. Insurers are creating a carve-out for PFAS so that they are no longer covering these liabilities. This is a moment in the markets, let alone in regulation, where people who know are doing better. And we have tools here in Canada. We have a risk assessment. We can risk manage substances such as textiles, as you discussed when it comes to turnout gear for firefighters. Well, there's PFAS not only in their gear, but also in our clothing, in our rugs, in our upholstery. So we need to go beyond firefighting foam in our regulations, but deal also with these opportunities that are right in front of us, existing substitutions to make safer products, because to your point, these are some of the most toxic substances. SEPA has been designed to prioritize those substances. We have Schedule 1 and we have Part 1 of that list that can give us all kinds of the tools that we need to address this and protect firefighters and protect the rest of Canada.
And, as a mom of young children, I think about, every time my child puts a toy in their mouth, the rugs that they're crawling on, lots of other jurisdictions in the States, in the EU, have tackled this. Can you talk a little bit about what we could learn from those jurisdictions and what we need to do here?
So the EU has laid out a roadmap beginning from an 18-month period to 13-year period. At the far end of that is giving lots of time for innovation in the market to address uses such as in electronics, where the market needs to shift and innovation can meet that gap, which is what happens when we make strong rules. Industry adjusts and reformulates. And the 18-month window is for known substitutions. We have a lot of opportunities in the moment to look to the leaders who have already done a lot of great research on this issue to get rid of PFAS in their own products. Moms know that a lot of children's products are now labeled PFC-free.
Thank you.
So this is one way that we're trying, but we can't buy our way out of this problem.
We'll go now to the second round. I'm going to reduce the allotted time by 40% because it is tight today. So we're talking about 3 minutes and a minute and a half. Mr. Deltel for 3 minutes.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président. Je vais tout de suite continuer.
Thank you, Chair. I'll continue the conversation with Ms. Barker on about the firefighters.
Challenge that we are facing with this issue, especially for our people who are protecting us, firefighters. Do you have an example in the world when this issue is addressed correctly that Canada can get inspiration from that?
I think that U.S. states have increased reporting. They now require reporting on product applications, and they're moving on specific product types. We heard about cosmetics. We heard about food contact materials. These are exposures that seem unnecessary. These are non-essential applications of this chemistry. So this is a moment for Canada to look to textiles, to look to that wash off into our waterways. Often these coatings are fragile. They degrade quickly into PFOA, which should be controlled in our water. So this is a moment for Canada to really not be the first nor the second. There have been many jurisdictions who have moved. And
never too long to be good. Monsieur Sauvé, je sens que vous avez de quoi nous dire là-dessus. Je vous écoute.
Oui, je voulais juste rajouter qu'il y a des formulations.
I wanted to ask that there are versions of firefighting foam without PFAS. So we have to make sure that the residues of PFAS containing foams should be used. Does that exist currently for use by firefighters, these foams? So where is that used? I know that in Quebec there are firefighters using these new formulas, and some firefighters prefer the old ones because they're used to them and they don't want to change. So there could be a stricter regulation to make sure that we no longer use the others. Is there a town you can think of in Quebec just like that? But we'll talk about it.
Thank you very much, and I hate to beat a horse, but I am very interested in this topic of PFAS as well. In my riding of Aurora, which is Richmond Hill, there's an organization, York Regional Environmental Association, Alliance, which has done a lot of work on this. And of course, the firefighters, both York Regional and Richmond Hill, I've met with and talked about this. So one of my questions really has to, you just said that a lot of the firefighting foam, they're all alternatives now, there's something available. So what are the essential uses that we have to continue to allow these chemicals to be put into these projects? Which ones are absolutely essential?
Absolute necessity is a relative term, I guess. To me, there are probably some medical application, some hospital application where the PFAS are needed, and PFAS are part of chemicals in some of the antibiotics, so they use so. There has to be some exception for medical application, and I can live with this. Making electric car batteries is currently, scientifically, it's feasible to do without PFAS, but the factories and the production cannot scale it up very quickly. So there has, the industry will need delays before they can adapt, but they'd rather not do it. So unless we give them a deadline, they're never going to do it. But
I know my time was cut short, so I did want to ask Ms. Barker a question too, which is, it says here 4,700 human substances that have PFAS in them, and I understand that's growing the number of PFASs all the time. Is it possible to go through this risk management process and to look at each individual PFAS to determine whether they're toxic or not, especially given cumulative effects? Or is there an argument for these being put together as a class and not allowed except when they're proven not to be toxic?
The world's leading scientists on this issue have been pushing since 2015 for the world's governments to deal with this issue as a class-based approach. And when Canada began this process in 2021, 4,700 was the number being used by the OECD. And in the past 3 years, every time we look, we find more PFAS. Industry has had a number of opportunities to disclose the knowledge that they hold around these harms, around the uses, the releases. This is not an unknown issue, and research has demonstrated that this data has been hidden from regulators, it's been hidden from people, and their efforts right now to undermine the class-based approach should be considered meddling. That is not desirable for real
Une
action.
minute et
Thank
demie,
you.
2 minutes, oui, oui. Allez-y, Madame Posé, vous avez le temps d'une bonne question.
Please go ahead, Madame Posé. You have time to ask a good question. So, thank you. I'd like to come back to federal management of pollution. That follows Leah's questions and answers. In 2021, the Canadian Environmental Law Association stated that it would be better to use PFAS compounds as a category rather than dealing with the substances one by one. So since then, there have been some changes in the in SEPA. So we were working over that last year. So in your opinion, the regulation of these substances in Canada, is it sufficient? Is it adequate? And I'd like to give you all the time to speak. I'd like to compare that in comparison with other administrations. I listened to a podcast and you spoke a lot about what's happening in the U.S. Well, it's certain that if there are two aspects to group regulation, regulating as a group. So it means we would have a interdiction of using it everywhere, a ban on using it everywhere. But with the fresh water or drinking water, we have to be measuring it. We have to target some molecules to be able to measure it. So Health Canada's approach was targeting about 30 different PFAS. That was a good approach. In the U.S., because of their lot, they just targeted 4 or 6 specific PFAS. So they're not using the broader approach, but it corresponds to what the UE is doing, or EU is doing, rather. They're doing it all as a group. But the Americans, with the substances that they're able to measure, they're much stricter. They're the strictest in the world. So they have an approach that can't cover everything, but they're very strict with what they can identify. Thank you very much. Ms. Collins?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. A question for Ms. Barker and Mr. Sauvé. Just, we've heard about the high levels of forever chemicals in fish and the impacts on northern communities, on Indigenous rights, and the right to fish and hunt, and cultural practices as well. Can you talk a little bit about the disproportionate impact of PFAS on marginalized communities and northern communities?
Well, a lot of those communities eat a lot of fish and a lot of sea mammals, and the sea mammals, because they're on top of the food chain, are very contaminated with PFAS. So they end up having a higher burden and a higher load of PFAS because of what they eat. And, it's better for them to eat fish and sea mammals because it's very nutritious and it's high-quality food compared to fast food or the alternatives. So yes, there's definitely a higher burden on them, but I want to emphasize that the fish at the supermarket is also loaded with PFAS. The fish that you're buying and that you're eating and that I'm eating. But not to the same level as some of those indigenous communities that really depend on them for food.
I would add that we shouldn't be setting up an impossible choice for people to practice their culture, to eat food that is nutritious and available. I think that the choice should most definitely be put to industry to question all of these claims of essentiality that are being put onto PFAS, that it is unlikely that the range of comments and the nature of the undermining efforts to not only in Canada but around the world to push on not regulating this class and taking strong action.
We'll go to Mr. Mazier for 3 minutes.
Chair, I'd like to move that the committee resume debate on the motion that I moved on March 19th.
The next speaker is Mr. Van Koeverden, and then Ms. Collins. Oh, it's a dilatory. Could you read that again? I'm sorry, I was confused.
I'd like to move that the committee resume debate on the motion I moved on March 19th.
Okay, that's dilatory, so we just go to a vote. Okay? Excuse us for a moment.
So to resume debate on the motion that Mr. Mazier moved on March 19th. Madame Chatel?
Looking at which motion are we debating.
Motion was it? That was about the roads and the cars?
It's about the documents and the,
documents.
analytics.
So for clarity, if I could, you're asking to resume debate on the motion right now.
Yes.
Which motion?
The motion for documents.
Yeah, it was March 19th. Notice of motion, March 19th. The committee ordered production of Environment Climate Change Canada's provincial territory. Computer general equilibrium model with a whole bunch of technical stuff inside.
Yeah, can I make a point of order at this point?
No.
Well, I mean, it's got to be a point of order because we're proceeding to a vote.
It'll apply to this.
Okay.
So we're prepared to, on division, accept the motion as long as we, and I wasn't anticipating doing this right now because we have witnesses, but if we can accept that the timeline is just between now.
Let's do it then.
Mr. Chair, just point of process. I think we have to vote on resuming debate before we can start debate.
So let's vote on resuming debate. Yeah, okay.
Can we have?
We just do it unanimously?
Yes. Thank you.
Okay.
Let unanimously agree to resume debate and propose an amendment.
Okay.
Everybody wants to resume debate?
Yeah.
Okay. So we've got Ms. Collins and Mr. Van Couverden.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think this is a very straightforward motion to procure some information that I think the committee deserves to hear, Canadians deserve to hear. I think I have a different opinion on the carbon tax than the Conservatives, but I think being upfront about modeling is important.
Okay. Mr. Van Couverden?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The modeling is available and demonstrates that pollution pricing is working. And surely the Conservatives wouldn't be moving this motion if they didn't believe that climate change existed or that the emissions are coming down. So perhaps this is progress on the behalf of the Conservatives, and maybe next they'll also admit that they're cashing their rebate checks. So I'm happy to let this go.
So we're all in favor?
Yeah. As long as we accept the timeline is instead of 1 week, it's just before the next committee meeting.
Just as is.
Are we adopting it as is?
They won't be completed in a week. So if we can just agree to be flexible on the timeline, then
as is.
Okay. Is there unanimity that we adopt as is?
On division. That's it.
On division. Okay, it's adopted on division, and now we'll go to Madame Châtel.
Back to the study.
The last question in this round.
Yeah.
And it belongs to Madame Châtel.
There you go. Okay, perfect. Thank you.
For 3 minutes.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So let's come back to our witnesses. I have a question for you, Mr. DeMarco. We talked about the Canadian Water Agency, and you also talked about collaboration of breaking down silos, to have more data, to be more efficient. What, in your opinion, would be the role of the Canadian Water Agency in this leadership that several people mentioned, saying that we needed more data, more collaboration in order to work in a more efficient way? And several levels of government and associations. We talked about agricultural producers also who need data in order to be able to manage everything. Mr. DeMarco. So it's a bill, and so I can't talk about it very much, but I have read this bill. It's rather more of a framework for the agency. There's not a lot of detail. There are not many objectives. It's really enabling legislation. So we'll see what the agency will do. But coordination, collaboration, the use of all powers which the federal government has with fisheries, so navigation, their international power, their criminal law powers, as with SEPA, or legal powers, and I would like us to be able to focus on results. That's something that we often don't have with these kind of bill that's just a framework. I would like to see that they have real targets and objectives for freshwater in Canada. As a Canadian, I come from southwestern Ontario. I see that we have a lot of similar problems with Lake Erie that we had in the 70s. So I would be happy if the agency could be focused on results